Hello, and welcome to the Narrowing Path, Walking the Spiritual Walk. My name is Steve Van Eiderstein. Thank you all for joining me again today as we read the next chapter of I Was a Pagan by V.C. Kitchen. Here you go. This is the copy I'm going to be reading out of. If you're interested, you can also get a reprint copy that's called Believing in False Gods. I Was a Pagan by V.C. Kitchen. It's the same book, just each page is printed. So we're going to go in today and do a reading of the 5th chapter, and then next week I will give you a follow-up with my review of the 5th chapter. And let me tell you, I've been thoroughly enjoying every single chapter we've gone through. I hope you all are too. So here we go. This is going to be 5th chapter from I Was a Pagan by V.C. Kitchen. Chapter 5. This Business of the Supernatural. Realities. Science had promised some future excursion into the spiritual domain, but present results, however thin and shadowy, seemed more inviting than a mere promise of future discovery. The dubious whispers from another world intrigued me vastly more than the utter silence which appeared to reign in this world of sterile philosophy, standoffish science, and stuffy religion. And I get into touch with this other world. I began experiments in that form of motor automatism known as the Ouija board. Do not, however, misunderstand me. The very genuine discovery, the complete and satisfactory solution to life's problems that I had hinted at throughout these early chapters, is not and never was a Ouija board. In fact, I would advise my readers to let this eccentric toy strictly alone. Warning. Most of the messages that I obtained from this device were utter nonsense. And when occasionally they were more coherent, the advice imparted was no more helpful to me than the strictly human advice I sometimes asked for and then proceeded to disregard. On one occasion, for example, what was supposedly the spirit of my maternal grandmother advised me that since my father's death, I had not been sufficiently attentive to my mother and that she needed my comfort and love. I realized that this was so and did nothing about it. I continued to be just as aloof, disinterested, and embarrassed in her presence as I had always been, and just as ashamed to let her know that I, the son of a woman's Christian temperance union treasurer, had started drinking without her knowledge or consent at the tender age of about 15. When, however, I received spiritual advice and power of the kind I am going to describe throughout the balance of this book, I knew exactly what to do about my mother, and I did it. And I was brought closely into her affections for the first time in many years. I am now, in other words, receiving spiritual aid, not through a nonsensical Ouija board nor any other spiritualistic instrument, but through God consciousness, through direct personal contact with the third environment, the spiritual environment I had so long been seeking. I had previously failed to receive this aid for the very simple reason that I had been trying to supply all the power myself. Even after I learned that the power for moral growth would have to come from the outside, I believed that the Lord helps those who help themselves. I was keen on self-management, a self-determinist, the captain of my own soul, if not a tugboat. And there is the real secret of all human difficulty. Since I now know the answer to these difficulties and did before I slipped the first sheet of this book into my typewriter, you may ask why I have taken 5 chapters just to recount my failures. It is because other people by the million, are making those same mistakes and going through the same failures over and over again. And they think they have found the answer to life, as I did, when they too have chased and momentarily caught up with pleasure or possessions or some other of the 5 false P's, perhaps passing by the unsatisfactory stage of immature development. They had sought, as I did, the comfort of sterile philosophy. Perhaps then, as I did, they faced the dreary prospect of an unwanted morality, or tried to force a stodgy ethical culture on a reluctant humanity. Perhaps again, they have lived with me in Fool's Paradise, which believes that science can do anything, little witting, as Robert H. Lowell says, that scientists are led astray by tradition, by timidity, and by the unchecked play of fancy and emotions, just like other people. Perhaps, with all this thinking, they too have formed a beautiful idea of what might happen for themselves, and especially for society. Could their particular philosophy or system of ethics or theory of science be applied to the uplift of humanity as a whole? Perhaps they have slaved in some branch of the world improvement while harboring the lurking fear that their sacrifice is futile. Undoubtedly, at some time, they have regarded mankind as a fine, upstanding, self-determining body, able to work out its own salvation. Once it got rid of the superstition, of religion and other outdated traditions, and began to live under the rule of reason. Perhaps the briefer outline the reader is still living in, the cramping confines of a self-centered, egotistical plan number 1. Perhaps he had moved into the larger but still narrow and abortive, socially centered, humanistic plan number 2. Perhaps again he is still leading nothing but a church-centered life, fondly imagining that he has attained the God-conscious life abundant of theistic plan number 3. Perhaps, in short, while groping his way through these dark places, he is still trying futilely, as I was, to solve not only his own personal and family problems, but the problems of the whole world, by means of a totally inadequate vision, and insufficient power. I would like, in such cases, to rescue him from unavoidable frustration and inevitable failure in life, just as the Oxford group rescued me. And I would like to introduce him to this disciplined army of life changers who, for me, first gave real meaning to life and direction and its purpose. I, excepting for my one brief baptismal glow, had never had a real religious experience in my life, and yet as soon as I found I had to have religious experience before the veil lifted from my eyes and allowed me to see the suprasensible light of spiritual domain, I had, in other words, actually to become God-conscious before I could see what lay behind my previous failure to do so. I had to gain supernatural insight before I could see the true nature of my own and other men's natural mistakes. The Oxford group, however, has a most natural way of introducing one to the supernatural and, in their skillful hands, God's miracle of changing lives seemed no more unnatural than the many natural or physical phenomena we were accustomed to observe. With this change, but not before, could I see the reason for my former failures. It was as if I had stepped all at once from the ordinary world of the 3 dimensions into a 4th dimensional sphere. It is difficult to describe such matters to those who have not yet gained spiritual insight, just as it would be difficult to explain colors to a man who is colorblind. Moral blindness is just as sure in its effects, and it is a blindness which clears away only when you become sensitive to the light of the spiritual realm. In ordinary terms, therefore, I can only say that I had been unable to see that light because I stood in my own way. I had suspected, as you may remember, that there might be some suprasensible kind of spiritual light, just as there were ultraviolet rays of sunlight and invisible means of knowledge which flow into our minds. I now found that this was so. Found, as I also suspected, that the coarseness of my own nature obscured this light to a degree which made me unable to see it. Powerful as is this light of God, man's own shadow will blot it out of consciousness. I had buried my nose so deeply in my own coat collar that was so eminently conscious of my own desires in life that I could not, at the same time, be conscious of anything else. When I later occupied my mind with the troubles of the world, these did not by any means squeeze out my self-absorption. Self-absorption. They simply added to the absorption as a whole, absorption away from God. The light of a candle is unnoticed in a room already illuminated. God cannot be heard in a mind busy with other and coarser matters. I also had been wrong in thinking that I would be able to emerge from my self-absorbed state by slow and gradual evolutionary degrees. Despite my former suspicion of sudden conversions, I found that a man had simply to step out of his own light to become immediately and keenly conscious of the presence of God. As W. Ellsworth Lamson says of St. Paul, he did not climb by any laborious Platonic stairway to the heights whereon God stood. He was there. I too was there. As the emergent evolutionists might say, I emerged into God consciousness all at once. And, as another member of the Oxford group has said, there could be no question of it. I knew that God was there. I seemed, in other words, to teach a critical point in sensibility. On the one side was a self and self-consciousness and moral blindness. On the other side stood God consciousness and moral vision. And I had passed from one to the other as suddenly and definitely as water brought to the critical point passes into steam. Even the steps which led up to this leap do not seem to be evolutionary or progressive steps in the usual sense of the word. Evolution commonly denotes a process of organization, of accretion, and of building up. It was a filling up with new and additional things brought together and organized in the mind and body. My spiritual growth, however, had especially that sudden leap into God's light, demanded an entirely opposite process. It was a process of breaking down, of disorganization, of emptying out, a matter of deflation of my own self-esteem, until self-approval and concern for the approval of others had shrunk to a point where I was willing to step entirely aside and give God a chance to shine. I do not mean that with this sudden emergence I became perfect in character, nor that I rose in any real height of spiritual understanding. A spiritual babe has to grow spiritually after he is born, just as any other babe has to grow. I mean only that such a birth can and does take place suddenly. One moment I was blind, the next I could see. This sudden stepping out of the darkness is difficult, and particularly difficult for a man who does not realize that he is blind to start with. Blind fish who swim in subterranean caves cannot imagine such a thing as sunlight. Neither could the wholly selfish blind man I am about to describe. This portrait of a man was drawn by his wife, not built up from her own opinions of him, but derived from the things which he himself has said that he likes, he hates, or cannot stand. She simply took down notes of his own utterances as follows. He hates prohibition, marriage, the routine of his existence, responsibility, duty to his family, drunken parties for other people, with his own gang, they are grand, having to live with his wife. He cannot stand crooners, religion of any kind, having to visit his mother, sitting still, resting in bed, censure of any kind, particularly of himself, selfishness in others. though not in himself. Unkindness, also in others, but not in himself. Restraint of any kind. Moral movies. He likes boats, water, swimming, liquor for himself, when and as desired, freedom to do as he pleases, the world as he is having it, himself as he is, being let alone to go to hell in his own way, which he describes as just wanting others to be tolerant towards him. Admiration from others, especially other women. Having his own way in all things. He cannot imagine giving up his self-will. This man is so vividly conscious of these likes, aversions, and dislikes that he literally cannot become conscious of any outside attitude. They make so much noise within him that he cannot hear any other voice. If his wife, for instance, should resent his attention to other ladies, he cannot possibly grasp that point of view. He puts it down as intolerance towards him and is totally unconscious of her real needs and feeling in that matter. When selfishness stands between a man and his wife to such impassable degree, when he is so insensitive to the needs and wishes of a person he sees every day, how can he be sensitive to the needs and wishes of a God he has never seen and will not even admit? I have given an extreme case, you may say. Well, read over this list again, and see how many of these likes, dislikes, and hates you yourself may possess. This crass form, moreover, is by no means the only form of selfishness. There are many subtler ones. I know, for instance, a sweet old lady full of what some people call good works. Described as a saint, she was to me a devil in disguise, for year after year her good works in my behalf consisted in telling me what a clever chap I was, when what I needed to be told was that I was a conceited ass. I remember that she kept telling another woman what a splendid wife and mother she was, when this splendid wife and mother was selfishly doing more to ruin her husband and spoil her children than almost any woman I had ever met. The liking to be nice to other people so that they will like you may be an unconscious form of selfishness, but it is selfishness, nevertheless, and a form of selfishness which lets the other fellow down far more than would a blunt assertion of indifference. In my own case, in fact, I found that self crept into almost everything, whether subtly and subconsciously, or whether in crass defiance of good taste in other people. And whether indigenous or gross, this selfishness had as surely shut me off from true consciousness of God. Not only that, but self-interest, even under the guise of social benevolence, had been dragging me further and further back towards the brute. Even when I set myself a high ideal and purpose, my life was almost entirely lacking in moral effort. When, as the Reverend Dr. Bernard Iddings Bell has said, the moral endeavor slackens, then an epoch ends. Then a civilization goes to pieces, and men, subsidizing once more to levels essentially animal, carry out their task of mutual self-destruction. Moral endeavor slackens, I know, as soon as self-interest quickens, and that, I think, is what has brought the modern world into the sorriest plight it has ever known. How, then, does one reverse this process? How did I accomplish self-deflation instead of continuing the advancement of self-interest? I believe the forerunners of science, the alchemists of old, had a better grasp of this problem than do many of our modern scientists. It is said that these alchemists were mystics who were not merely trying to turn lead into gold. They realized that the glorious results that might be attained through the transmutation of man's soul into spiritualized gold. They thought this could be done by an awakening of the inner conscience, which, in order to achieve this magnum opus, must first be free from all ambition, hypocrisy, and vice, and from all faults such as arrogance, boldness, pride, luxury, world vanity, oppression of the poor, and similar inequalities. I once put this down as a simple-minded superstition, but now I know from personal experience that the alchemists were right. I also know that these ambitions, hypocrisies, and vices were not drained out when I transferred my belief in one plan or philosophy of life to another. They were not drained out by making New Year's resolutions, and they were not disposed of by going to psychoanalysts or by going to church. They were drained out by stopping the self-effort to get rid of them, by letting God take hold to do the job and putting God first in life. I had put God first in theory, yet still continued to mean well and do badly. That was because I was still trying to run my own life. I had not put Him first in living, but had kept my self-love uppermost and had built my scheme of things quite upside down. When I turned things around, however, and I had put God at the head of the list, when I ceased struggling to pull myself up and stepped out of the way so that His light could shine down to me, when I let Him show me how to use the individuality He had given me to accomplish for myself, for humanity, and for Him, the things He wanted to accomplish, then, for the first time in 40 years, things of consequence began to happen in my life. I came at that time not only into consciousness of God, but into usefulness for God. I was able to do, through God's help, what no man has been able or ever will be able to do for himself. I was able to supplement that all-important why of life with the still more important how of living. I was able to begin really solving my own problems, and for the first time in my experience was given the power to begin helping others. I no longer wished well to myself alone. This, however, is jumping ahead in my story. I want to take you from the occasion on which I first met the Oxford group down to the time when, through this book, I first met you. It was a sort of Pagan's progress, which I will show you how I and thousands of others have been led to the one great emergence in life which can solve either personal problems or the problems of an over-troubled world. It will show how, as we begin to grow in this new life, we reach towards new heights of spiritual accomplishment and understanding. Well, there we go. That's the exciting stuff right there for me. You know, this is where he talked about the actual change in consciousness. That was powerful stuff. That was exciting stuff. I enjoyed reading that. You'll notice there's a couple clips in this video. The mic kept unplugging and stopping the video. I apologize for that. Hopefully it doesn't make too much of an impact when I put the videos together. And I am looking forward to reviewing this chapter very much. So thank you all for joining me, and I'll be back again next week with a chapter review. Have a good week, and until next time, thanks.